all black, everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
For the whole panel, you know, we're celebrating now 50 years of Freedom Summer. And when we think about that generations and their very innovative use of social protest strategy, you know, in terms of sit-ins, you know, the Freedom Summer where you got all of these young folks, some of privilege, who gave up their summers, you know, to go into the Deep South, you know, to register people to vote, right, you know, in which there was no guarantee any of these folks were actually going to vote. If we go 30 years into the future, you know, what do people say about, you know, this generation of digital natives in terms of how you have used social media and wedded it to social justice movements?
Is that for everybody?
That's for everybody.
You know what? I think, and I'm happy to be a part of this. I think our generation is going to be one that genuinely experiments, invests, and develops models for collective leadership and collective vision making. It may seem a little bit counterintuitive for me to say this because I'm the more public face of my organization, but I think the future will see less individual figures and more of a collective building of a narrative and collective movements. And I think social media is going to allow that, because to be quite honest, in any other field, it's quite easy to reach a level of celebrity and notoriety on your own. And so it's also very easy for you to lose all of that. And so, you know, each individual has an opportunity with 140 characters to become famous and become well known. And so we're more used to that. And so the luster of that, I think, is a little bit less, even though more people invest time in it than I'm comfortable with. But I think our generation in 30 years, people are going to say, you know what, they really started to develop a model of what a real collective vision could look like. One that's not guided by just one personality, one organization, one color, one race. And I think that's very problematic for the systems that oppress us right now. And I think it's why the internet is a great frontier for us to invest in and not to avoid, because on there we have the opportunity to build something bigger than any of us can do in one day by ourselves.
Meredith?
Yeah, if I could add to that, I would say what people will look back and say is that these people showed us the power of digital community. Just to expound on what Phillip was saying, with digital connectivity, we're interrupting narratives. We're making the news media pay attention to the things that we want to talk about. And as with Freedom Summer, where you had white privileged kids coming down to the South so that their parents had to pay attention to what was coming down to the South.
Right.
You've now got people in digital communities who otherwise wouldn't have a reason to pay attention to what these students are doing. And they have to, because it's interrupted the inflow of information in terms of gatekeeping. As a newspaper editor, I have to see what's going on Twitter. Why is this trending? And you see that we're collapsing categories of economic background, educational background, region, gender. Just like Sofia said, you can't tell by just looking at someone what kind of factors they have. You get online, it's a more equal playing field, and I think that'll be the legacy of this generation of digital natives.
Sofia?
I do agree with Phillip. I do think we have to put more intention behind that vision, though, and behind building that kind of structure that will facilitate collective leadership. I think some of us in the movement are aiming for that, but there are definitely some celebrity figures that do exist within the immigrant youth movement. We do a pretty good job of keeping it organic and having multiple leaders, I think, than in previous movements. But I think as a whole, we need to be way more intentional about making sure that folks know we are aiming and we are striving for a movement that has collective leadership, and even defining and breaking down what that means for our youth. I can say most people probably don't know what that translates into, right? What that looks like. We don't have the language and the structures, the organizations, et cetera, to facilitate that as much as we would hope. But I do know that working with Phillip, working with a lot of other organizations that are led by youth of color in particular, we're aiming for that vision. We need to make that vision, I think, more of the dominant narrative than it currently is.
And you know, the irony of this is that, you know, everything that I've heard all of you just describe, you know, this is Ella Baker, talking in 1958, 1962 about we're not interested in creating leaders, we're interested in creating leadership, right? So that there's always a structure in place that allows for people to provide their own leadership, not to have to ship leaders in, to bring people in from the outside. So it's an interesting kind of connection, right, between that generation, what we might define as our greatest, and the generation of digital natives now. Let me ask you this question, Micah, particularly from the fundraising side. There's something poetic about the fact that Harry Belafonte is still with us. And in some ways, much more of an agitator and a radical than he was, right, when he was at his prime, right? What do we need to do, or is it being done already? Because when we think about, Harry Belafonte, it wasn't just about like he was on the front lines. He was writing checks, still writing checks, right? How do we find or encourage the generation of the Harry Belafontes, at least in terms of their celebrity, to really engage with the kind of social movements that we're seeing now? What's the structure for that? Like when I think about Andre Young, Dr. Dre, and not even talking about the fact that he's now a billionaire, right? But he writes a $70 million check to USC. He never went to school. Right. He was never a college student. So it's not like folks don't understand the value of giving, but how do we translate that giving into things that are meaningful to our communities?
Yeah, I think if there's one single thing I would say, it's having a generation of older leaders that are willing to courageously invest in young people. And I think that's something that we miss. There's almost a sense that folks, young people that got an opportunity by the generation ahead of them to lead. So Howard Fuller here in Durham, North Carolina, who was doing this organizing work. The challenge is for those folks when they get an opportunity to be empowered, they're like, well, I was so young, I made so many mistakes. We don't want to redo that or retread that. And so there's a real push in this older generation to really block young people from leadership because they feel like they're not ready. And I think the single biggest thing I would say is we need folks that are going to courageously invest, also give them support, give them assistance, give them counseling, coaching, guidance, but also courageously invest in their leadership. And I think that's, if there's one thing that I feel like is missing, it's that.
And it's interesting because, when you think about the civil rights generation, I mean, A. Philip Randolph was still there, but he also understood how to step aside and let that generation, there's something to be said that we continue to talk about our leadership, in terms of these 70-year-old, early 60-year-old men, over and over again, and I think part of what social media has done, right, and we're still obviously struggling around issues of gender and sexuality, in our communities and in our movements, but it has really positioned people to be much more on par, much more egalitarian. And I think in terms of the voices that emerge.
Yeah, and I think we're really recovering from the distorting impact of traditional media. Right, so we had a movement that was much more egalitarian, much more grassroots, much more diffuse. When the New York Times showed up, then you have the media contact, right? The one person, the spokesperson. When Martin Luther King gets up and gives a speech, he's the focal point. And so I think now we finally have the tools as a movement to really create a different model for what leadership is like.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything.